April 29th, 1945. A shattered hamlet near the Elbe River, Germany. The world has been reduced to the smell of damp earth and the cellar's musty darkness. For 19-year-old Lieselotte Brandt, a former signals auxiliary for the Luftwaffe, reality is the grit of crumbling mortar under her fingernails and the rhythmic tremor that vibrates through the stone floor. It is the sound of an empire dying. Above, the symphony of the front line has devolved into a ragged, percussive chaos, the sporadic crack of a KAR-98K, answered by the methodical, ripping burp of an American BAR. Then a new sound, a grinding, metallic growl that seems to chew up the very air. It gets closer, shaking dust from the ceiling beams. Half-tracks. The 7 women huddled in the darkness with her are shadows defined by their breathing. Some pray in frantic whispers, their words swallowed by the noise. Others are silent, their fear a palpable, cold presence in the cramped space. They had been part of a communications relay unit, ordered to fall back, to regroup, to wait for a counterattack that never came. Now they are just stragglers in the great collapse, their gray-blue uniforms and worn boots offering no protection from the inevitable. The rumbling stops directly overhead. Heavy footfalls thump on the wooden floorboards above. Shouted words, harsh and guttural, but not German. English. Lieselotte's heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She squeezes her eyes shut, picturing the posters plastered across every city, the grinning, leering monsters in foreign uniforms, the warnings from their commanding officers about the fate of German women who fell into enemy hands. Propaganda, perhaps, but in this moment, it feels like prophecy. The cellar door scrapes open, a blinding rectangle of gray daylight that makes them all recoil. A silhouette stands there, broad-shouldered, a helmet blotting out the sky. It holds a rifle, an M1 Garand, she notes with the detached part of her mind that still functions, and points it down into the darkness. Raus, Hendehoek, get out now. The voice is loud, impatient, devoid of emotion. It is the voice of a man who has done this 100 times before. One by one, the women rise, their movements stiff with terror and exhaustion. They climb the stone steps into the light, hands raised high, blinking against the sudden glare. The world outside is a study in monochrome, a low, weeping sky, the skeletal remains of a farmhouse, and soldiers, American soldiers. They are everywhere, moving with a weary, practiced efficiency. They are younger than she expected. Their faces are smudged with dirt and stubble, their eyes hollowed out by fatigue. They wear the insignia of the 84th Infantry Division. A sergeant with a square jaw and tired eyes directs the proceedings. This is Staff Sergeant Frank Miller of Baker Company. He has been fighting his way across Germany for months, and his patience is a finite resource. He watches the women emerge, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Just more mouths to feed, more paperwork to process. He gestures with his rifle. Line 'em up, over by the wall. A younger GI, a private barely older than Lieselotte, prods them forward. They stumble over rubble, their hands still in the air. They are searched, not gently, but not with the malicious cruelty they had been taught to expect. Pockets are emptied. A few personal letters, a tarnished locket, a half-eaten biscuit. The trivial artifacts of lives now utterly derailed. They are now officially prisoners of war, stripped of everything but the uniforms on their backs and the terror churning in their stomachs. As they are marched out of the ruined hamlet and onto a muddy track leading west, the cooled reality begins to sink in. They are no longer auxiliaries of the Third Reich. They are captives, and their journey into the unknown has just begun. The road is a ribbon of mud, churned into a thick, greedy paste by the tracks of tanks and the boots of countless soldiers. It clings to their shoes, making every step an act of will. For 2 days they march. The small group of female auxiliaries is absorbed into a larger, shambling column of captured Germans, a sorry collection of exhausted Wehrmacht infantry, grim-faced old men of the Volkssturm, and hollow-eyed boys from the Hitler Youth. They are a river of gray uniforms flowing against the tide of the American advance. Jeeps and GMC trucks laden with fresh troops and supplies rumble past, splashing them with filth. The GIs on the trucks sometimes stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and sheer indifference. No one speaks to them. They are ghosts, specters of a defeated army. Lieselotte walks beside a woman named Helga, a quiet radio operator from Dresden. They don't talk. There is nothing to say. They focus only on placing one foot in front of the other. Hunger is a dull, constant ache in their bellies. Thirst is a fire in their throats. At night, they are herded into muddy fields or the skeletal remains of barns, guarded by perimeter sentries. They sleep fitfully, huddled together for warmth against the damp April chill, the sounds of distant fighting a constant menacing lullaby. The guards are a rotating cast of weary American faces. Sergeant Miller's platoon is tasked with escorting this particular group. He is a constant presence, his eyes methodically scanning the prisoners, the terrain, the sky. He isn't cruel, but he is hard. He treats the women with the same detached professionalism as the male soldiers. They are prisoners. Security is paramount. On the evening of the second day, the column is halted at the edge of a dense, dark forest. Rumors ripple through the ranks of prisoners. Partisans, werewolf commandos, holdouts still fighting in the woods. The American officers are tense. The decision is made to march through the night to reach a more secure collection point on the other side. This presents a new problem. Guarding over 200 prisoners on a narrow track through a black forest is a security nightmare. An order is passed down the line. Sergeant Miller receives it with a grim nod. He walks over to a supply truck and returns with his men, carrying ropes and something else, something that makes a cold, metallic jangling sound. Lisa Lotta walks them approach. Her blood runs cold. It is a length of heavy chain, the kind used for towing vehicles or securing farm equipment. A corporal begins to bind the male prisoners' ropes with rope, pairing them off. But Miller and another soldier head directly for the women. The terror they had suppressed for 2 days comes flooding back, raw and overwhelming. Helga begins to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. "Was wollen Sie?" she whispers. "What do they want?" They expect to be separated, singled out. Every horror story, every piece of Goebbels propaganda screams in their minds. Miller stops in front of them, his face unreadable in the twilight. He says something in English to the private with him. The private hesitates, then unwraps the chain. It looks heavy, brutal, covered in a fine sheen of rust. "Hands," Muller says, his voice flat. He demonstrates, holding his own wrists together. There is no negotiation. There is only the command. Trembling, Lisa Lotta extends her hands. The cold, rough metal closes around her wrist. Another loop goes around Helga's. The private fumbles with a padlock, the click of it locking, sounding as loud as a gunshot in the silent dread. They are chained together, like animals. The final shred of their dignity feels stripped away. As they are pulled to their feet to begin the night march, the weight of the chain is more than just physical. It is the weight of utter subjugation, a symbol of their complete and total defeat.
The forest is a place of phantom shapes and menacing sounds. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sends a jolt of fear through the shuffling column. The chain is a living thing, cold and unyielding. It chafes Lieselot's wrist raw, and its weight is a constant, dragging reminder of her status. The physical connection to Helga is a strange torment. Every time one of them stumbles in the dark, the other is violently jerked, the metal biting deeper. They learn to move in a clumsy, shuffling unison, their steps dictated by the unforgiving length of steel between them. The American guards are tense, their rifles held at the ready, their whispers sharp and urgent. To them, the chains are a practical matter, a crude but effective tool to prevent prisoners from melting away into the darkness. To the women, they are an instrument of profound humiliation. They emerge from the woods just as the sun begins to bleed a weak, gray light across the eastern horizon. Before them lies a large farmstead, its buildings miraculously intact. But it is no longer a farm. It has been transformed into a massive, chaotic prisoner collection point. Barbed wire has been hastily strung between fence posts. The main barn and its surrounding fields are overflowing with captured German soldiers, a sea of gray that stretches as far as the eye can see. This is where the local streams of prisoners converge into a river, to be processed and sent further west to permanent camps. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, mud, and human despair. Their group is shoved through a gate into a crowded holding pen, a muddy enclosure sectioned off with more wire. The arrival of the 7 chained women causes a brief stir among the other prisoners. Some stare with pity, others with a kind of morbid curiosity. Most are too lost in their own misery to care. Lieselot and the others huddle together, a small, isolated island in the churning chaos. The chain keeps them tethered, forcing them into a miserable intimacy. They are exhausted, filthy, and stripped of hope. Sometime around mid-morning, a jeep pulls up near the command post set up in the farmhouse. A captain emerges, his uniform cleaner than those of the frontline troops. He carries a clipboard and a look of stern authority. Captain Daniels is a logistics officer, tasked with bringing order to this chaotic influx. He is a man of regulations and procedures, and his war is fought against inefficiency. He begins a tour of the perimeter, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He confers with the NCOs, checks the guard posts, assesses the water supply. His gaze sweeps over the holding pens, and then it stops. It narrows, focusing on the small cluster of women. He sees the glint of metal. He sees the chain binding them together. His expression hardens. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even disgust, crossing his face. He strides over to the edge of the pen. "Sergeant?" he barks. Sergeant Miller, who had been overseeing the distribution of a meager water ration, straightens up and jogs over, his M1 rifle slung over his shoulder. "Captain," he says, his voice respectful but weary. The captain points a rigid finger toward Lieselot and her group. "What is that?" he demands, his voice low but sharp. Miller follows his gaze. "Prisoners, sir. Came in with a column from the east. We moved them through the woods last night. Security measure." The captain's eyes stay fixed on the chain. "Get that off of them," he says. "It is not a suggestion. It is a direct, unequivocal order. We are not the SS. Find the key or get some bolt cutters. Do it now." He turns on his heel and marches back toward the farmhouse without waiting for a reply. Miller stands there for a moment, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He looks over at the women who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and confusion. He then turns to the private who helped him with the chains the night before. "Find me those cutters," he says, his voice flat. The private scurries off. The women watch Sergeant Miller walk toward their enclosure, his expression grim. They see his hands are empty, but they know he is coming for them. They shrink back against each other, the chain rattling with their trembling.
The world shrinks to the muddy ground of the enclosure and the approaching American sergeant. For Lieselot, time seems to slow, to stretch. Every detail is magnified. The way Sergeant Miller's boots squelch in the mud, the grim set of his jaw, the deep-set exhaustion in his eyes that she had not noticed before. He stops just outside the wire, waiting. The private returns, panting, holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters. The tool is immense, utilitarian, and in the women's terrified imaginations, it transforms into an instrument of brutality. They press back against one another, a single organism of fear, bound by the steel that now seems to be the focus of this terrible attention. Miller unlatches the makeshift gate and steps inside, the private following close behind. The other German prisoners in the pen give them a wide berth, their faces blank, wanting no part of whatever is about to happen. Miller walks directly to the women. He doesn't speak. He simply gestures with his chin, an unspoken command for them to present their hands. Helga lets out a small, choked sob. Another woman, barely a teenager, begins to whisper the Lord's Prayer. Lieselot's mind is a vortex of panic. She sees the blades of the cutters. She thinks of the stories of torture, of mutilation. Why this? Why now? Was the march and the humiliation not enough? "Das ist nicht nötig," a woman named Ursula suddenly says, her voice trembling but clear. This isn't necessary. It is a plea, a statement of defiance, a whisper of human dignity in the face of absolute powerlessness. Sergeant Miller's eyes flick to her face. He doesn't understand the German words, but he understands the tone. He sees the raw terror in their eyes. For the briefest of moments, something shifts in his expression. It is not pity. It is something closer to a weary acknowledgement of a shared, wretched humanity. But he has his orders. He gives a short, sharp nod to the private. "Get on with it," he grunts. The private, a young man from Ohio named Jensen, looks as uncomfortable as the women. He approaches Lieselot and Helga first. He lifts the heavy cutters. Lieselot flinches, squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for a blow, for a crushing pain. She hears Helga's sharp intake of breath beside her. Then there is a loud metallic snap. Not the sound of breaking bone, but the clean, sharp crack of shearing steel. The tension on her wrist is gone. The weight vanishes. She dares to open her eyes. The private has cut the link of the chain between them. He moves to the padlock on her wrist, but it's too thick. "Sarge," he says, "padlock's too hard." Miller takes the cutters from him. "Hold it steady," he commands. He positions the powerful jaws of the tool around the shackle of the lock itself. He puts his weight into it, his muscles tensing. Lieselot holds her breath. With a final, loud crack, the padlock breaks apart and falls into the mud. The chain slithers from her wrist like a dead snake. She stands there, stunned. The private moves down the line, clumsily but efficiently cutting the other chains, freeing the other women from their bonds. Sergeant Miller watches, his face impassive. When the last chain falls, he takes the bolt cutters from the private and turns to leave the enclosure without another word. He doesn't look back. The entire event has taken less than 2 minutes. The women are left standing, their wrists red and raw, but free. They look at the severed links of chain lying in the mud. They look at each other, their faces a canvas of disbelief and profound confusion. They had prepared themselves for the worst cruelty imaginable. Instead, they were met with a baffling, impersonal act of decency. It was not kindness, it was not mercy in the traditional sense. It was simply an order, a correction. And yet, in the context of their world, it felt like a seismic event. The removal of the chains was a small thing, a logistical adjustment in the vast, grinding bureaucracy of war. But for Lieselot Brandt and the 6 women with her, it was everything. The silence that follows the soldier's departure is heavier than the chains had been. The women stand motionless in the mud, staring at their own hands, flexing their fingers as if reacquainting themselves with a long-lost part of their bodies. Lisa-Lot slowly lifts her right hand and touches the raw, chafed skin of her left wrist. There is no pain, only a strange, tingling numbness. The physical relief is immediate, but the emotional impact is a delayed shockwave, rolling through her in confusing, contradictory waves. They had been braced for barbarity, conditioned by years of propaganda to expect the absolute worst from their enemies. That expectation had become a shield of sorts, a way to prepare the soul for its final violation. But this act, this simple, unemotional removal of their bonds, had shattered that shield. They had not been spoken to with compassion. No one had offered an apology. Sergeant Miller's face had remained a mask of stoicism. And yet, the order had been given. Someone in the American chain of command, a nameless, faceless captain, had seen them and decided a line had been crossed. A line they themselves no longer believed existed. Helga finally breaks the spell. She sinks to her knees, not in despair, but in a kind of weary collapse, and begins to cry. Not the silent, terrified tears of the forest march, but deep, shuddering sobs of pure, unadulterated release. One by one, the others follow, huddling together, their arms around each other. They are no longer a linked chain of captives, but a small, fragile circle of human beings. From across the compound, Lisa-Lot watches Sergeant Miller. He is back to his duties, supervising the distribution of K-rations from a crate. He tears open a box and hands a biscuit to a young Wehrmacht prisoner, his movements efficient and detached. For him, the moment is already over, one more task completed in a day filled with them. He is a cog in the machine, and the machine had, for a moment, operated with a sliver of humanity. It wasn't about him or his feelings. It was about the regulations of his army, about a code that, even in the midst of total war, still held some meaning. For you, watching him, you realize the most profound acts of humanity in war are often not grand gestures of heroism, but quiet, procedural decisions made by tired men who are simply trying to do their job correctly. As the day wears on, the reality of their situation remains unchanged. They are still prisoners, they are still hungry, their country is in ruins, and their futures are a terrifying blank. But something fundamental has been altered within them. The caricature of the enemy, the one-dimensional monster they had been taught to fear, has been replaced by something far more complex, a man who could chain them one night and unchain them the next, an army that could conquer their nation with overwhelming force, but would still pause to correct a minor indignity. In the coming days, they would be moved again, processed, interrogated, and sent to a formal POW camp. But that single moment in the muddy farmstead would remain, a defining memory of the war's end. It was not a moment of forgiveness or friendship. It was a moment of unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition, however brief and impersonal, that even on opposite sides of a brutal war, beneath the uniforms and the hatred, they were all still human. The chains in the mud were proof.